New York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
How did the worlds of hip-hop and boxing unite, blending together music, race, sports, and politics? We'll explore this cultural collision that led to collaboration next.
Sing along.
Hello, history lovers, and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio, and a special tip of the hat to everybody watching today's time travel adventure via our YouTube and Rumble channels. Remember, you can find me at historyauthor.com and across social media platforms. Plus, you can read my columns in the Washington Times to get my analysis of current events through the light of all this history I've picked up in these books behind me. Today's book, today's author, is somebody I can definitely see reaching out to for a quote about something in politics that needs an analogy from the world of sports and music. Our guide on this journey is Dr. Todd D Snyder, who I'm so pleased to be able to welcome back to our time machine. His book is Beatboxing: How Hip-Hop Changed the Fight Game. We previously caught up to discuss his book, Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. Meeting Muhammad Ali's man, his corner man, Drew Bundini Brown, was an experience that really stuck with me in a way that made me think, man, I'm scared that I might never have read this book. It's that special. Definitely check out Bundini, or first, if you want, check out my interview with Todd D Snyder. He is an associate professor of rhetoric and writing at Siena College in Albany, New York. That's his official title, but the kids call him the hip-hop professor. He also grew up in boxing. He was the son of a trainer in West Virginia. He's a guy who's excellent at divining the poetry in rap music and how it developed this symbiotic relationship with the sweet science. You can find him online at hillbillyspeaks.com or on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Okay, I know I'm excited to get started this week. I'm excited to introduce all of you to Todd D Snyder. So let's join him as the fighters are about to step in the ring with some hype music blasting through the speakers. Let's learn how he got to beatboxing. And here we are with Todd D Snyder. He's joining us to rap about his new book. See what I did there? Beatboxing: How Hip-Hop Changed the Fight Game. Welcome back to the History Author Show.
Hey, thank you so much. It's my pleasure. I'm a big fan. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm sincerely humbled by that because I'm a big fan of your writing. I loved your last book, Bundini. I said it was the kind of book that I was afraid. It scares me now to think that I might not have ever read that book, that your publicist at the time, Lissa Warren, wouldn't have given it to me because it was that great. It was that special. I find myself thinking of Bundini often. So when I saw you had a new book, I said it's going to be a really excellent one. And so I wanted to have you on to discuss it. And sure enough, I pick it up. I read that first chapter and it's already really clever. You craft it carefully. It doesn't just say chapter 1 and you jump into it. It's called Tale of the Tape. And it has the parentheses there around cassette, Tale of the Cassette Tape. And it got me to thinking, certainly took me back to the 90s when we were talking about this transformative moment between Tyson and Tupac. It made me think kids today, your students certainly, they can't really conceive of the limitations of cassette technology, but also how their uniqueness made them really precious, made it special, how you'd pass it around and you drop it in a bucket of water or drop it on the ground. You'd take that pencil and try to get a little more life out of it. Sometimes open it up and do surgery on it if you could. That made them special, and it made the music special. So why did you decide to throw that as your first punch when you're writing beatboxing and begin with that technology to start us down this road?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Anyone who's ever watched a big fight on pay-per-view or on Showtime or a DAZN, the first thing that happens right before the fight begins is we see the tail of the tape, where we look at the two boxers, we look at their weight, their height, their reach, their record, how many knockouts each opponent, each guy has. And, as I was putting this book together, I knew that it was going to require a pretty thorough introduction because I think for outsiders, hip hop and boxing are two different worlds. And the argument I'm trying to make is that they're sort of intersecting worlds. So I thought, let's do the tale of the tape. Let's size up the two sides of my personality, the two compass points to my identity, so to speak. So I thought about, okay, how do I set the tale of the tape for readers, so to speak. And as I thought about that concept, I thought of how important tapes were in my life as a kid growing up in the 80s. The A side to my life was hip hop. It was my first love. I loved it from probably second grade on. Hip hop was the window into literacy, language, politics, sports. Hip hop is the reason I'm a writer. It got me interested in poetry. It made it cool. And I was a kid from a working class, sort of hyper masculine town, and hip hop poets were cool. I could get away with liking that type of poetry. So the A side to the introduction talks about how important cassette tapes were to my life as a young kid coming up in the trailer park in West Virginia. And we didn't have malls in my town. We didn't have places you could go buy hip hop. I had to take a handheld cassette recorder, hold it up to Yo MTV Raps, and record those songs and make my own little mixtapes and give them to my friends on the playground. So right from the jump, I was sort of a hip hop scavenger. Those cassettes were very important to me. And anytime I had a birthday or Christmas, I would get a big bucket of Maxwell 120-minute cassette tapes. So, those were very important to my identity and very important to me being able to get hip hop. It was my only access to it, was holding that recorder up to the television for Yo MTV Raps or, whatever show was on. The other side to my identity, the B side, has to do with my father being a boxing trainer. I grew up the son of a boxing trainer. My whole life was watching fights with him. He had a loaded cable box, so we watched every pay-per-view. We watched all the big fights. And we would record them on VHS, and my father would sort of play professor to me. We would watch the fights back, and he would tell me the history of boxing, and we would analyze the strategy of the fighters. So in my bedroom, in the trailer park that I grew up in, I had all these cassette tapes with hip hop that I sort of bootlegged off the television, and all of these VHS cassette tapes. There were, a library, that's sort of a fight library. There was a big bookshelf in my room, looked like the one behind you, full of fight tapes. And we taped everything, even if they were just Joe Blow versus, some, journeyman. We taped it and watched it and tried to learn from it. So I wanted to introduce readers to me and my connection to hip hop and boxing. And I also wanted to talk about the importance of those artifacts, as you say, to kids like me who, didn't have access to hip hop in an easy way. People who were born outside the culture, so to speak, or kids who couldn't go watch a fight at Madison Square Garden. So those tapes were incredibly important to me. And it was my way of introducing myself to the reader and explaining how hip hop and boxing have become really my two passions, both professional and personal.
Let me ask you now, put you on the spot. Do you have, even though you'll never play it, even though CDs and MP3s have come along and the sound is much better, you have any of those cassette tapes still there hanging around in your office? Or did you have that moment where you threw them all out?
For your listeners who are unaware, my day job is I'm a professor at Siena College in Albany, New York, and I teach hip hop courses on hip hop history and rhetoric courses on hip hop. And when students come to my office, I have all of my cassette tapes. I got all my CDs. They think CDs are old. That CDs are ancient to them. Forget cassette tapes. And I've had students who come to my office, for a conference, and they'll literally want to pick them up and look at them. It is like a historical artifact to these millennial kids. So yeah, I do keep those things in my office, although my wife made me get them out of the house. So they're at my office at Siena College. So they're no longer in my house.
The one fight you can never win, no matter how much you train.
I lost that one. But I did keep them because I do think they're important for students to see how we experience the culture and the music. Mixtapes were a huge thing. Once I could get access to hip hop, making mixtapes for my friends, and some of my friends I met through boxing who lived in more urban places would bring me mixtapes, and that's how we experienced the culture in the 80s and early 90s. So the introduction to the book is my way of introducing myself to the reader, but also introducing folks to the ways in which those two cultures intersect, and always have, I think.
There's another piece of low tech out there that I picked up in beatboxing, and also took me back to my own days of mixtapes, and that's cardboard. And people who are, like you said, your students maybe leaning in saying, what, cardboard? What could be the big deal? But if you walk through the neighborhoods that you're talking about in the city, you'd see breakdancers. You'd see them on the subway platform here in New York City, and that good piece of cardboard. I had friends who were breakdancers, and you get a new fridge and they'd say, hey, you can use that box? And they would use that piece of cardboard over and over. It would become shiny from them doing their routines on it. And it was really something special. You didn't want to fold in it. It was a little bit of a technology, and you'd know where those guys would set up. And so reading Beatboxing, I thought of the breakdancers and the way you knew who was in what neighborhood, where they came from, but also how that helps create or lay the groundwork for these two worlds that join in beatboxing, because you had guys who were from not just the same city, not even just the same borough as in the Bronx, but guys who are often from right on the same street. So how does that community set some guys that maybe haven't seen each other since they were in high school on different paths? One guy goes to the boxing gym, the other guy goes to the recording studio, but they maintain that connection. How does that help these two worlds to merge, and how do you explore that in beatboxing?
Yeah, first of all, I should bring you to my hip hop class, because we were talking about b-boy culture last week in class and the importance of cardboard. And I told those exact same stories that you were just outlining. Wow. The importance of having a good piece of cardboard to do your moves, right?
Yep.
But to answer your question, I think the point that needs to be made, or the point I tried to make early in the book, is that both hip hop and boxing draw from this very similar sociocultural demographic, one that requires participants to be scavengers, right? I mean, in hip hop, it was taking an old piece of cardboard and you could do your windmills, do your b-boy moves on. In boxing, it's not a sport like lacrosse where you need a lot of gear, or ice skating, or something where you need to be a part of a club team or a travel team. Like boxing, you go in a gym, they're always in the toughest neighborhoods. The best gyms in boxing history are always in places that draw from the lower rungs of society. Well, hip hop for its first 20 plus years did the same thing. And one of the big surprises of this book, Dean, is that a lot of the rappers I talked to started out in boxing, and vice versa. A lot of the guys started in boxing and ended up in hip hop. Or, I heard countless stories, guys like D Smoke who wanted to be a boxer first and ended up in hip hop. Guys like Adrian Broner who wanted to be rappers but became boxers. And some of that's discipline, some of that's having the right people around you, some of that you get punched in the face and realize that being a DJ is an easier thing to do. But these guys are coming from similar neighborhoods. In hip hop and boxing were outlets for folks who didn't have time, a way to get music lessons, or didn't have the opportunity to play on a travel baseball team or something like that. The fact that you had to be resourceful and you had to use what was there, what little avenues that were there in your neighborhoods to climb out of those circumstances, I think it's one of the big connectors between the culture. These guys walk the same cracked pavement streets.
I love that aspect, because you see these guys at the top of the game and we think of all the ancillary parts of fame, and we think of things like Empire, and now these guys have entourages, and now people are cheering them everywhere and trying to get close to them and use them. And then across a room, they spot a guy from the neighborhood, a guy who knew them back well. And there's a whole different kind of connection there. And I picture those other people who are just there to exploit a fighter, just there to exploit a musical artist. And now they have to step back and say, whoa, wait a minute, this person comes in out of nowhere and has a connection. I love those moments. Just as I love the one when you were talking about your last book, Bundini, with me. And Chuck D looks at you at one point as if to say, wow, you know your stuff. And you make that connection. And boxing obviously is all about connecting, and also rap, it's about hitting the right marks and about the beats. And music has to be very exact, or it's gonna miss your ear, hurt your ear. So I wanted to ask you, you talked about those A and B sides of your personality. How did your knowledge help you connect with your boxers, connect with these artists, and dig for deeper answers, get them to open up in a way that maybe if you'd just been just another professor and Chuck D is sitting there and he says, okay, I'm just here for a bunch of college kids, they don't really know me or know my work. But then when you make that connection, he opens up to you. And he also, nobody wants to feel silly. I'm telling people a deep aspect maybe of my boxing career, my rap career, and this guy's just not getting it. This is going to get edited out. He's going to want to talk about my pet cat. So how did that help you open up as an author when you're writing Beatboxing, that as soon as you walk in there, you have common ground with these guys?
Really, the beginning of this research started with a program that we run at Siena College, the school where I teach. It's called Hip Hop Week, and we do it every March, and we celebrate the core elements of the culture, breakdancing, DJing, graffiti, emceeing, and we bring in a hip hop icon from one of those worlds every year to come talk to my students, have dinner with them, and do a lecture that's open to the public. One of our first guest speakers, as you mentioned, was Chuck D. And ironically, you know, during dinner that night, almost all we talked about was boxing. Because, you know, I show a movie to my students every year called Ali Rap, and Chuck D is the narrator of that. And in that piece, Chuck D sort of argues that Muhammad Ali was the prototype for the first rapper, right? You know, he wasn't a rapper, but his persona, his rhetoric, his bravado became the formula for the first rappers that came along a few decades after Ali. So Chuck and I sit there at dinner, and all we talk about is Ali and boxing. Of course, Public Enemy, his group, did walkout music from Mike Tyson. It was, you know, Tyson was the first heavyweight champion to walk to the ring to rap music, and it was to Public Enemy. And at dinner, Chuck D said to me, you know, Tyson was undefeated to our music. When he fought Buster Douglas, he didn't come out to Public Enemy. And I had to go back and watch the tape, and he's correct. So, you know, he said it was a joke between Public Enemy and Tyson. If he would have came out to Public Enemy, maybe he would have finished Douglas off. And that really was the beginning of me thinking about this book. Is every time I would bring a speaker to my campus, we would end up talking boxing. So I got these rap icons coming to talk to my students, and the subject always went to boxing because they were just like me. They saw the interconnection between the two worlds. And I'll tell you a funny story I didn't put in the book. So when Grandmaster Flash comes to Siena to be our keynote speaker, it's right before the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight. And at dinner that night, pretty much all we talk about is who's going to win that fight. And me and Grandmaster Flash literally got into an argument. He said Pacquiao was going to knock out Mayweather. And I was like, no way, Mayweather's too good defensive. And it was just a funny moment to me where I realized all of these hip hop guys I work with are just like me. They love boxing, they love hip hop, and they see that the two worlds are pretty much the same, and they're connected in really intricate ways. So it was through meeting guys like Chuck D and Grandmaster Flash that I realized, you know, these guys know their boxing. And I'm sure they felt that about me too, that this guy, you know, he understood both worlds because I come from both worlds in a lot of ways. So it was Flash and Chuck D who really got me thinking about this book. Years later, I finally made it a reality.
Who turned out to be right, you or Flash?
Man, Mayweather won the fight. I didn't gloat about it though, because you don't gloat around.
No. This was one of the topics I want to get to in a little bit, and that's the idea of your work on the meaning of manliness and what it is to be a man, and boxing, a manly sport. Rap certainly is also a manly endeavor, and how this manhood comes together. So I want to talk about that. But first, I didn't want to go too long without mentioning the genesis of this marriage between these two art forms. And that's the two men that people can see if they're watching via YouTube, stylized in the title of Beatboxing. Mike Tyson and Tupac Shakur are both there on the cover. They're linked in history. On September 7th, 1996, the Tyson-Selden fight at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. And I'm old enough to remember, even as somebody who's not, of course, as steeped in boxing as you, but that was something with crossover appeal with Mike Tyson, because everybody was talking about him, and people would be talking on the nightly news when usually they would be talking about impeachment or talking about President Clinton at the time or whatever those things happened to be in the mid-90s. And along comes Tyson and changes the game in a different way. He's a unique fighter than Ali. So, but he's such a personality. And I remember he's going to unify the titles. This is a big moment. And here comes Tupac Shakur. He's going to be there with him. That's a big moment. And of course, the excitement later turns to tragedy. So how does the sports relationship to hip hop forever change when those shots ring out in Vegas?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'll begin by saying Mike Tyson is really hip hop's first champion, and maybe hip hop's first athlete to really embrace the culture and perform that identity to the American public. Before he links up with Tupac, as I mentioned previously, he walks to the ring to Public Enemy's music. Fight the Power, Welcome to the Terradome, those songs off their iconic album, Fear of a Black Planet. So Tyson starts walking to the ring to hip hop music, and then everybody does it because Mike Tyson was the catalyst, he was the trendsetter, so everyone starts doing it after Tyson. But when Tyson gets out of prison, he's on that war path to get his titles back. Tupac is the #1 rapper in the world, and the two men had an interesting friendship that I write about in the book. And ironically, the two men were not free at the same time for very long. They became pen pals in prison. Tupac would visit Tyson and vice versa. These guys were both locked up around the same time in the mid 90s. So when they're both free for the first time, both trying to reclaim their titles, so to speak, Tupac is the most controversial, popular rapper in the world. Tyson is obviously the biggest fighter since Ali, probably, and he's trying to reclaim his titles. Tupac begins making original music for Tyson. So it's not that he would walk to the ring to a Tupac song. He would walk to the ring to a song Tupac wrote for him, that where Tupac raps about the guy he's about to fight. And he's rapping about Frank Bruno. He's rapping about Bruce Seldon. Original music, original lyrics. It changes the game. It's so exciting for kids like me who love Tupac and love Tyson to see those forces collide in one place. And as you mentioned, it ends up being a tragic moment in both the history of hip hop and the history of boxing. Tupac is shot a few hours after Tyson knocks out Bruce Seldon in the first round. He dies in a Las Vegas hospital 7 days later. And, you know, really, I call it the Big Bang moment. It's such a huge moment in history that, you know, now hip hop, if you watch a boxing match today, you'll see many concerts. You can hardly watch a pay-per-view where there isn't a rapper performing a song or maybe a few of their songs as their friend walks to the ring. It was just such an iconic moment that it forever transformed hip hop. It forever transformed boxing. It was a tragic moment. We lost one of our great legends in hip hop at 25 years old. And of course, Mike Tyson never wins a title fight ever again after that night. So I wrote about the story in the book of their friendship and also the sort of ripple effect of that moment in history.
It's all about that. The butterfly wings, they say, right? And I'm laughing because you wouldn't think, wow, the butterfly is Ali, right? How strange that I'm just going down this road. But you don't think of Tyson as the butterfly. He's more like the freight train. Yeah. So, but it's true. These are the things that you find here in beatboxing. It's not just something where two guys are slugging it out, and rap people certainly misunderstand the art and the poetry in that, what they pick up. So I love that your book says, hey, come in, you could learn about both of them. And speaking of learning about both of them, this is something also in beatboxing and also about fame. You look at guys like Tyson and Tupac, two guys that are at the top, just like those two guys from the neighborhood, when they hook up, yeah, they can meet each other and say, well, okay, you're not trying to get something from me. I'm not, and everybody around me is trying to get something from me. And Mike Tyson certainly had that in his life. And people are always that they want you to do this, endorse my that, play my song, talk about this. That's why people ask, why do these guys have bodyguards? Mike Tyson, when he goes to a bar, because every schmuck on a bar stool wants to pick a fight with him. That's why. And if he loses his temper and hits him, then he's in jail. This guy's going to get looking for a $500,000 payoff. Yeah. And you have some of those moments in beatboxing where Tyson says of Tupac that in a weird way, he was like a Roman general and he took himself real serious. And for me, for my point, that got me to thinking. That stays in the back of my mind then if I hear the music. And so I wanted to ask how readers of beatboxing will find not just how these guys opened up to you because they saw you shared their passions, but what did you learn from them about when they tell you moments like the one that I just shared there that, oh, hey, Tyson told me something or Tupac told me something that nobody else knew. We have this great moment that I'm going to share with you. What moments like that are there in beatboxing?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot. And it was interesting to me that when I would talk to rappers, how much it meant to them to see these great fighters walk to the ring to their music. Because it's like this ultimate sort of badge of honor, I suppose. Like Big Daddy Kane, who was an icon in rap music. I interviewed him for the book. And he said when Bernard Hopkins would walk to the ring to his music, he felt a real sense of pride. Because it was a way for Bernard to sort of shed light on his career. And, you know, it was important to guys like Big Daddy Kane, the boxers trained to their music, that it was inspirational to these guys. And also to a lot of the fighters who I interviewed, they felt like like they had made it when they hear their name in a Jay-Z song. Now, I talked to Zab Judah, who's from Brooklyn. And, you know, Jay-Z shouted him out on a song on Jay-Z's Blueprint album. And he said, I listened to it like 5 times in a row. He couldn't believe it. You know, he was very proud of that. So one of the big surprises to me is how much the two cultures respected each other. And there's so many similarities. I mean, in boxing and hip hop, you get a short window. You know, a typical boxer's career doesn't go beyond 5 years unless you're really great. Hip hop's the same way. The music industry is the same way. You have to be great. You have a short window of time. It's a young man's game in both worlds to live your dream and to make it. And the ways in which the two cultures respected each other and honored each other, I thought was fascinating. I think it's one of the reasons we see these mini rap concerts at fights. And it's become so frequent that now it doesn't shock anyone. We see them almost every big fight. There's someone walking out with a rapper. I think it's because the two cultures respect each other so much because they know what it takes to come from the bottom to make it in these worlds where you only have a small window of time to make it.
You're enjoying my conversation with Todd D Snyder. He's author of Beatboxing, How Hip Hop Changed the Fight Game. Visit him online at hillbillyspeaks.com, or you can find him at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Masta Killa of the Wu-Tang Clan writes of the book, The Masterful Art of Chess, Kung Fu Swordplay, and the Sweet Science of Boxing are all hip-hop expressions that connect us universally. Beatboxing tells this story. It's razor sharp. Todd, I wanted to say to you that I read that, and already you could see the art there and you could see the poetry in what Masta Killa says. And this is not what we might expect if we just heard. And this is about so many people that I've found reading these books and reading about history and being in news and being in media, meet somebody not ever really what the popular persona is, especially for boxers. You think about it, they're in the ring for a couple of minutes and then the fight's over. Today, a little different with social media, but even that, rappers are, okay, I put out my album, people know me from my album. I may be playing a character. You have a great story in Beatboxing about one of the, a fight that never happened that they retell in a rap song. So to get to know those guys, that's so central to beatboxing. That's why I keep coming at different aspects of it. Masta Killa mentions universal appeal, and I wanted to ask you how that goes into the story of beatboxing. What are some of the elements that somebody who never watched a boxing match, somebody who, or is just casual about it, knows it's out there, somebody who never picked up a hip hop album, they're surprised to find reflected in these books or in your book, because it does have universal appeal. It does speak to real history and our larger story as human beings, and this unique expression that we've got to watch be born in our lifetimes.
Yeah, listen, I think if you look at our language, we use boxing metaphors every day. I'm up against the ropes, I'm down for the count. We use all of these, like, this boxing terminology because boxing is such a metaphor for life. And life is a fight in so many ways. And we use those particular phrases because I do think you can watch a boxing match and know nothing about strategy or even the history of the sport and be inspired by it. And I think hip hop can do that too. Music in general can do that. You don't have to understand every lyric or know every, double entendre to get the feeling of the music. So I think music inspires people in general, people who understand struggle, or people who've been through tough times. They'll put on a particular album or a song that'll either take you back to a happy place or inspire you to get up and do better in life. I think boxing does the same thing. So I think Masta Killa is right. I think there is a universal aspect to music and the art of boxing. I think it's one of the reasons boxing makes such great literature and also great films. I don't know the rules to lacrosse or like the Winter Olympics, or I don't understand curling, but boxing, you can get it by watching it. You can watch, Sylvester Stallone and Rocky and be inspired and not know a thing about boxing. And I think music works that way too. There's a universal aspect that even if you listen to hip hop in another language, you can catch the vibe and you can get something out of it. So I do think he's right. And, the Wu-Tang Clan, which have been so good to me and helping me with connections and giving me interviews for the book, those guys love boxing. I mean, they love it on a high level. They watch every fight just like I do. And the guys in Wu-Tang who I talked to, Inspector Deck and some of the other guys, they're real fight fans. They're not just guys who watch the big fights. They watch every fight. As you mentioned, it's in their lyrics. I mean, in a really intricate way. So I wanted readers to see that there's a high level of boxing literacy in hip hop music. And to really get hip hop, I think you have to get boxing. And to watch boxing today, at least, you have to know a little bit about hip hop to appreciate what you're seeing.
At least to get everything out of it that you could be getting.
Yeah.
And I was mentioning that about how media portrayals are. And here you mentioned Rocky, and I wanted to mention that about films as well, to ask you what they get right and wrong, because I'm thinking of how unique it was that when James Brown comes out during the movie Rocky 4 and there's that fight between Apollo Creed and Ivan Drago. What do they get right and wrong about moments like that? That presages it. That's a decade before we start to see what you're talking about in beatboxing, where hip hop is a staple of fights. And you would, if these guys came out to nothing but a voice, you'd say, well, what's going on now? Your ear would say there's something missing. Where's the music already? Yeah. So what do movies and TV shows get right about fights and wrong about fights, and right and wrong about rap and the relationship between the two, so that these guys aren't just cranking out a soundtrack. These guys aren't guns for hire. They're putting real feeling into their stories, into their songs, and the stories in their songs, and the boxers really care about them. What do you think that movies get right and wrong about those kind of things, about the A and B side of your personality in beatboxing?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I got a good story for you. I was interviewing Mathematics, who's the DJ and a producer for Wu-Tang Clan. And he's the guy who drew the Wu-Tang logo, that famous W, that you see on all the t-shirts. I was interviewing him and talking about hip hop ring walks and trying to get his opinion as to what he thought of them. Because there's some folks who don't like them. I was trying to get his opinion. And and I said, I think the first one that I can locate is Zab Judah brought out a rapper named Shine when he was fighting a guy named Teron Millette. And Mathematics corrected me. He said the first ever hip hop ring walk is in the movie The Great White Hype with Damon Wayans. And I said, what? Hold up, that's Method Man, who is his group member, raps Damon Wayans' character to the ring. And at that point, it had never been done in real life. It was like the scene from Rocky that you alluded to. It was sort of silly to watch it. Like, who's going to walk to the ring with a rapper, doing a live performance? It's a comedy. So it's funny in the movie, but he was correct. It really was in the movie the first time that ever happened. And then after the movie, it starts to really happen in real life. Art imitating life, or vice versa. I don't know which way you want to put it. But you're right. It was actually in that movie that we see that happen for the first time, and Wu-Tang was involved with that. Now, I do think hip hop and boxing both are stigmatized in a lot of ways. One, because a lot of boxers come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. I think some people see boxing as like this lower class sport. They look at it as, brutal or violent or whatever. And I think hip hop, a lot of the lyrics are, what the FCC would say are vulgar or grimy, or, that not for polite society. Well, those folks bring the slang and the language from where they come from too. So I think there's a stigma over both. And in Hollywood films, they're both stigmatized in a lot of ways. They're celebrated in a lot of ways as well. But I think it always comes back to these are sports, a sport and a genre of music that comes from oppressed people, marginalized people. And I think anytime you're from a marginalized community or a stigmatized community, Hollywood's not always going to be kind to you. So you have to really learn the history and learn about the artists and what they go through to understand the lyrics. Just like I think you have to be from those neighborhoods to understand how boxing's an avenue for people. Because most of us, if we could do something else, we will. We run from a fight. Most of us don't want to get punched in the face. And my dad used to tell kids in his gym, if you can do something else, you should. If you could play baseball, you should do something, you should. Boxing's for the least. It's for the people who have no other way but to get out. Hip hop, for its first 25 years, was the same way. It was for the kids who picked up some old dusty records and a microphone, some cardboard, like you said, and it was a way out. It was a way to express that anger and frustration of being from, tough socioeconomic circumstances. So I think Hollywood is not always kind to either one. But we're at a space now, I think we can appreciate both art forms, even if you didn't grow up in that environment.
What is it they say? The best way to win a fight is not to be there. So
yeah, that's true.
At least not to lose.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something that comes perfectly off what you were just saying to illustrate your feelings about these guys and about the stereotyping and stigmatizing and the making fun of it. And it's kind of for dim-witted people and all these attitudes. And that's to have you tell a story about Peter Guns out of the Bronx. Yeah. And he's approached by a couple of young fighters after this marriage of hip hop and boxing is taken off that you explore in beatboxing. And he just has a great reaction. And there's something that I want to ask you about it after you tell the story or point out for listeners. So go ahead, tell that story.
First of all, I love Peter Guns. He was one of the nicest guys I interviewed. He had a big hit, 1998. So he was someone who was there for hip hop's big golden era when it really started to boom and sell records, and underground legend MC who had a little bit of commercial success as well. So it's 1998. He's at the height of his fame, height of his popularity. His music is jamming. He's on a world tour, and he just happens to make a stop in Vegas. And he's at the hotel getting ready to go to the venue for his concert. And these young rappers approach him. He said they looked like they were in their teens, like really young kids. Said they were recording an album and they wanted to get him to come to the studio and do a feature with them. And I would imagine being a famous rapper, you get that all the time. And he said I kind of brushed him off and said, "Hey, you'll need to talk to my manager," and he kind of gave him a business card or something and kind of just brushed him off. Well, he said about 25 minutes later, he gets a peck on his shoulder, and it was kind of an aggressive peck. And he turns around, and it's Mike Tyson. And he's never met Mike Tyson in his life. And Mike Tyson is, super famous, and, he's a big fan of Tyson. So he turns around, and Tyson said, "Why were you an asshole to my artists?" And he said, "What? What are you talking about?" And he said, "These are my artists. I'm starting a hip hop record company, man. These guys are just trying to make it. You shouldn't be a jerk." And I'm laughing as he tells me this story. And I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, "What did you think I did? We went to the studio." So, they left the hotel and went and recorded some verses. But, he was starstruck to meet Mike, just like any of us would be. But Mike was not in a good mood. He was wanting him to, be a little kinder to his artists. And there's so many boxers who have started record companies. Floyd Mayweather, Zab Judah, Adrian Broner, Roy Jones, Mike Tyson. And once again, it's them trying to help guys from their neighborhood better themselves, climb out of their circumstances. So, there's a lot of boxers who have been hip hop CEOs, and there have been a lot of hip hop entrepreneurs like James Prince who gravitated into the world of boxing and became managers and promoters. Dame Dash from Rockefeller Records did the same thing. Jay-Z, of course. So we see a lot of intersection in the business side of this as well. Unfortunately for Peter Guns, he was on the wrong side of it that night. He had to change his plans and go record those verses.
Yeah, I love when you say that. He says, "What do you think I did?" You asked him what he did, and he's, "What do you think I did? I went and recorded." You're not going to say no to Mike Tyson at the peak of his powers.
Yeah,
but the little thing I wanted to point, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a funny story because Peter Guns is a tough guy too. And, he realized right then he needed to go record with Mike. That's the smart thing to do.
Like the cowboys used to say in the old movies, I told myself to walk small. And
Right.
but the little thing I wanted to point out there that I think is so important to everybody listening and watching is when you talked about Mike Tyson, you didn't do the thing that everybody feels compelled to do because these things have become just a caricature. And that's, you just said it in your voice. And when I heard you tell that story before in another interview, I said, I want to bring that up because that shows the respect that you have. And what you're going to get here in beatboxing is somebody who, this is not a drive-by book for you. And it's not a book, well, I'm going to write this book, publish it. I do this for a living from a college perspective, and I don't care. It's the easiest, cheapest laugh in the world to make fun of how Mike Tyson sounds or to make fun of how one of these other guys looks. And for instance, in beatboxing, you go over all of Tupac Shakur's tattoos. And I was blown away by that. You describing that, and that's detail. And you had a list that you could have put together of so many songs, I think 1,000, and you pared them down to 500 that you include in the book. So I just wanted to point out that little detail. It's not a question for you, but you can say something if you want.
That's the best compliment you could give me. I mean that, because this book is personal to me. I mean, hip hop saved my life. It's the reason I'm a writer. And boxing was the reason I got out of the circumstances I grew up in. It was my way out. So both boxing and hip hop have always been the compass points to my identity. That means a lot to me. This book is super personal to me. And I wanted to give every fighter, every MC the utmost respect. And there's some guys in there who are characters like Adrian Broner and even Tyson, of course. And I wanted to show the human side of these guys. I wanted to make Tupac Shakur a real man. He died at 25. And most of us look back to how we behaved at 25. I would be embarrassed if I had the microphone in my hand at 25. It's hard to tell what I would have said. Now that I'm a little bit older, I can really appreciate these folks for their talent. And I want to shed light on the circumstances they escaped. These are fighters on both sides, boxing and hip hop. These are people who are extremely talented fighters who I think we can draw inspiration from their stories despite their contradictions or despite maybe some character flaws they have. I think they're all stories that are inspirational to me. So yeah, I tried to write this with all of my heart and all of my sensitivity, because it is easy to talk about hip hop in a derogatory way, or boxing. Some of these guys have made mistakes, but who hasn't really, right? That's the way I look at it.
I'm laughing as you say that, because you said we can like these guys despite their contradictions, despite some of their hypocrisies, some of their bad actions, mistakes, their worst day. And I'm saying to myself, wow, almost like you get told about every other guy that's in the books that are behind me right now, where you say, well, yeah, Abraham Lincoln, sure, he did this. Sure, George Washington, he owned slaves. But this is more inspiring part of their life. It just struck me like a hammer there as you're saying it, because that's so true. And we're all humans, but it's so easy to look down on somebody, and we can't beat Mike Tyson in a fight, but we can make fun of his voice. And right. It's so cheap. And I'm not saying I've been above doing it. I'm kind of a mimic of a guy. I've done voice work and impressions and stuff, but in my life, in my career. But if you love the guy, I'm sure that he would understand it. But it's so easy to do it when you're coming from that bad position where you're making fun of him. I love that. So
too, just to jump in real quick, you watch guys, they'll fight 12 rounds and beat each other to a bloody pulp. And then at the end, what do? They hug. It's a sign of respect. Or rappers can battle in the streets. Breakdancers can battle in the streets and still have respect and love because they know what it takes to be good at their craft. And one of the things I really loved is talking to boxers about their favorite rappers and talking to rappers about their favorite boxers. They became people for me. They became fans just like me. Because you could tell when I talked to Big Daddy Kane, he was proud that Bernard Hopkins walks to his music. You could tell that, Zab Judah was proud that Jay-Z has mentioned him in his lyrics and had him in his music videos. You could see that mutual respect is there. And I don't know, it made these guys human for me. It made them not just their stage persona or their mythos. It made them real people. So, I did try to write about them in a way that humanized them, just like writing about Tupac's tattoos. They're fascinating to me. I think they're a window into his mindset. I wanted to write about Tupac the man, not the myth. Same thing with Tyson.
Yeah, and that's what I think we always do. I said caricature because that's kind of that's the derogatory way. And heck, he's been in a cartoon, right? Mike Tyson as well. But that's so easy to do. And I don't know the man obviously, but he seems to have found peace with those kinds of things and isn't looking to knock everybody's head off. But hey, that's what you're trained to do. I have a friend who played for Penn State, and he said, man, they're teaching you to hit all week when you're playing football, and then suddenly you have a bye week. And they told us, Joe Paterno, he says, used to tell us, don't go out to bars, don't go out to see, I'm doing his voice. And he said, because somebody steps to you, you're automatically, because you're being trained all week to do it. So I always try to think of that too, and I think you get that out of beatboxing. These are real human beings who are training and trying hard. Doesn't mean you don't also have feuds. You covered that, the James Prince and Floyd Mayweather, for instance, feud in 2003, which has a rap connection. Yep. I wanted to ask you also, though, about something that probably has been on people's mind here as I listen to you talk about beatboxing, and that's that the words beat, the words boxing, they're both things that are together in the title, obviously, of your book. But there are also things you think about beats and you think about boxing. And if you watched any of those great old Rod Serling movies, if you're of a certain age, or even ones that are more modern, you see Rocky in your head chasing the chicken. I had a great moment. I was trying to chase the stupid Canadian geese out of my yard one day. And I found if I just really harass them, they'll leave me alone. And I was chasing this one goose because he'd come after my wife and chasing him around the lawn. And these two young kids were riding bikes, and they said, "Training Rocky style." And I was blown away. I said, man, that gives you hope for the younger generation. For me, I said, what a great reference that this kid had pop into his head, right? So that is a rhythm. That's a training. That's a skill. He's got to be able to move fast to catch the chicken. And music definitely has to have that beat. Even the word rap is a sharp word, right? And it means something specific. So I wanted to ask you about that. Can you give readers what you hear in the music? Make it clear that this music isn't just for show. It's not just a soundtrack off one of those mixtapes or tapes or from a movie, but that it's an integral part of those years of training that lead up to the 3.5-minute song or the few rounds in the ring.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you got to remember, I began as the son of a boxing trainer. So I knew instinctively as a kid that music is a huge part of training in fighting. The first thing a fighter learns how to do is shadow box, and nobody shadow boxes without music. You know, the great Sonny Liston, he would listen to Night Train while he shadow boxed and jumped rope. Ali did. He would listen to James Brown and all his favorite groups, Sam Cooke. Like, music is a huge part of training. And I talked to a lot of trainers for the book, and I, from my own experience, know that rhythm is the most important thing in boxing. Power is not the most important thing. It's rhythm and timing, because it's whose punch gets there first is the guy who usually wins. So for a lot of the boxers I talked to, music was how they got their rhythm, and it was a very important part of their training. And they were very particular about the types of hip hop that they listened to while they trained. I also interviewed a couple of hip hop producers who say that when they go into the studio, they're often trying to craft the type of music that boxers would train to, or the type of music that would be played at Madison Square Garden or the MGM Grand during a fight. Because today, there's live DJs at all big boxing matches. And I interviewed one of them for Top Rank and ESPN, who they play hip hop music in between rounds and during the fight. And I mean, it's such a huge part of training. It's even a part of the actual fight itself these days. So, rhythm is, very, very important in boxing. And hip hop is music that is, in its inception, its early days, it was for breakdancing. That's the reason it was crafted. And it was for these, rhythmic movements. There were breakdancing battles. They were almost like a kata, these sort of, they look like fights where the guys would battle each other when they would dance. So the music has always been crafted for physicality, movement, rhythm. I just think more than any genre of music, it's built for this kind of world. And, I think it was Professor Griff of Public Enemy who said to me, well, it's natural that Tyson was listening to our music because he sure wasn't listening to Celine Dion when he was training,
Dido.
Yeah, right. Maybe the Eminem song with Dido. I don't know that, but yeah, you're right. It's like hip hop is in every gym. I grew up in rural West Virginia, and we were playing hip hop in all the gyms I was in. I've been in every gym in West Virginia. So it was like, even in places you wouldn't think, they play hip hop, sometimes just instrumental music, because it's such a great way to teach rhythm for fighters, especially young fighters who don't have rhythm.
It's key what they're doing. Celine Dion, it's a different beat, it's a different rhythm, and it speaks in a different way to people. So it's easy to caricature them, as I'm sure too, and do the accent, do the voice, and say, well, that's not. But there's different tools for different jobs, right? You're not going to try to change your radiator by using just a screwdriver. You're going to need other tools, right. And that's what rap becomes for these guys. Is it becomes a tool that they can use to learn the rhythms, and they're going to be fighting other guys listening to similar music. So I love that part of it. You may do, like they used to say, ballet for guys in the 70s. There's a couple guys in the NFL, right? It's because it's different movements you might want. It's different muscles you might want to exercise. So I love that part of it. I love that in beatboxing, certainly, because you have guys that are they're doing their own thing, and they need to hear their own music. There's a moment in Iron Eagle that's like that, if you remember, and it's great to bring up because it's a cassette tape. Kids flying up there in the F-15, I believe it is, and Louis Gossett Jr. saying, "Come on, you got to be able to hit these targets, kid, and you can't do it." And then he says, "Oh, come on, I got to listen to my music." And what does he do? He pops in a cassette tape. He starts listening to his music from the 80s, and next thing you know, he's a great pilot, which is absurd, but it shows how important the music is. And you don't listen though to rap when you're writing, right? You listen to other stuff.
Yeah, it's true. I'm not trying to disparage any other kind of music because there's rhythm in all genres of music. Ballroom dancing requires a certain kind of rhythm. I'm just trying to argue that the type of music that is made by hip hop producers is perfect for learning rhythm in boxing. The marriage is absolutely, and it's not accidental. It's on purpose. That's why I interview producers who make the music. But you're right. When I write, I never listen to hip hop when I'm writing, because if I listen to Tupac while I'm writing, I would just be sitting there listening to Tupac. So I listen to Ahmad Jamal or, just piano jazz, that kind of thing. So, certain music fits a certain context. And if you're in a boxing gym, hip hop is just perfect for the type of rhythm you're teaching kids when they first learn to spar or shadow box or hit the hand pads. It just, it's not accidental. It's not coincidental. It's there for a reason. It's made for that purpose. It's one of the reasons that, we see a hip hop halftime show at the Super Bowl. Ooh, that's so surprising and new. Well, there have been hip hop concerts at fights for the last 25 years. That's been happening because those two just, the marriage is perfect. You know, Lynn Swan listening to ballet music as he learns to be a wide receiver or to, you know, that fits that context. But hip hop is definitely perfect for what boxing trainers need their fighters to do.
Want to get amped up for sure. Dido would not do that. It wouldn't be the right tool for the
Probably
job.
not. Probably.
Is there a song in particular that you think of that is the song? For instance, Quincy Jones wrote the theme to Sanford and Son, and he just said, I look at Red Fox, I hear Red Fox, I know him, and also what they're trying to do with that show, Sanford and Son. And for me, that really struck me here in beatboxing. So many songs that you say, not just these guys love, but then they start to write songs for specific fighters. Is there one song that even if you don't hear the lyrics and you're watching a fight, you say these really sync up? Is there one that stands above the others, or a couple? I won't ask you to pick, but
Yeah.
are there any that stand out and you say that fits so well? It really was made for him.
Yeah, Tupac Shakur, the first song on his double album, All Eyes on Me, is called Ambitions That's a Rider. And it opens with this sort of haunting piano, this jumpy little beat. And there's even a guy on the track doing a Michael Buffer impersonation of Let's Get Ready to Rumble, right when the track starts. And Tyson walked to this music quite a bit. You know, after Tupac's death, he walks to this song, I think for 4 or 5 different fights. And a lot of other boxers have walked to the ring to this song as well. So it's sort of become the type of song you hear in every gym. You see it quite frequently when guys are walking to the ring. And I certainly loved it when I was training too. So I would think of that song as one that's specifically made for the ring walk itself, for that moment when the fighter leaves the dressing room and makes his way to the ring.
It definitely nails it to get in there and be able to hear yourself expressing music. They say showbiz, or politics rather, is showbiz for the ugly, that every politician dreams of being an actor, right? That's why you see so many of them pop up for cameos. But this is not, neither side is ugly. Each brings their own beauty to this marriage. You mentioned the halftime show at the Super Bowl this year. In beatboxing, you quote Snoop Dogg saying that artists were inspired by watching a Tyson fight, and that Iron Mike was inspired by their music. So I wanted to ask you what inspiration you want people to take today when they read beatboxing. How do you want them to be inspired in whatever their area of expertise or interest or passion is?
Yeah, one thing I tried to do with every artist, be it a hip hop artist or a fighter that I write about in this book, and I tried to balance it so that it's equal hip hop, equal boxing, so that both worlds could appreciate it. I tried to tell the story of who they were, like their fathers, their family members, their personal struggles. And I think, as I began to write the book and do research, I found out pretty quickly that there was a lot of similarities in these stories. People who had a lot of obstacles put in their way and persevered where most of us would have probably given up. And that's why when we watch a great fight, we watch Ali Frazier, we're inspired. Because, we know that it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up. And, hip hop music can be that inspiration for a lot of kids, and boxing can be too. I think the best compliment anyone has given me from reading this book is the folks who say to me, I'm not a boxing fan, I'm not a hip hop fan, but I got something out of this. I was inspired by this person's story. I was inspired by what this person overcome. Because, like I said, the guys I write about in this book from both worlds are fighters. When it comes down to it, they're people who just have tenacity and won't give up. And I think you could read this book and not know much about either world and still be inspired by what some of these people have overcome in their lives. So it's a history lesson in some ways, that we see the ways in which music has impacted sports and pop culture and vice versa. But it's also, these are human stories. And I think that's what excites me most, is these are people who have overcome a lot of tough stuff. And I think, we're in America, we like an underdog story. And whether or not you're coming out of boxing or hip hop, you're probably an underdog. Maybe that's what drew me to both cultures. You
write at the end of beatboxing, when you're giving your shout outs yourself, as you say, that's part of the rap culture and of boxing. And you say something that is very interesting and goes with what you were just saying, and about the neighborhood and about the support for each other and the cross-pollination and creativity. And that is that no rap star or fighter views their success as an individual. And that struck me because I know they're the ones at the mic on the one hand, they're the only one in the ring on the other hand. But then you think, okay, they got guys in their corner. They have producers, as you just mentioned, easy to overlook. So what do you hope people learn from beatboxing about, hey, these two seemingly solitary endeavors, no matter what your endeavor is, why should they pick up beatboxing to learn how, even when you feel like you're the only one in the ring, even when you feel like, well, this is my creative endeavor, I don't want anyone else, I don't want to ask for help, and I'm going to make it my way. What do you hope, especially young people like your students, will learn from beatboxing about, hey, it's good to collaborate, it's good to support each other, and maybe if you do, maybe if you're open to that, you could give birth to a whole new thing like hip hop and the fight game now being this marriage that we all think they were always married.
Yeah, well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. Folks who don't come from the boxing world often don't realize boxing is not an individual sport. One guy gets in the ring and the bell rings and he's the one taking the punches, but it's a team sport. I grew up in boxing gyms as a kid, and I saw what it takes to get in there. You know, it takes a lot of people helping you, working together to get the fighter ready to do that impossible thing of going 12 rounds with no headgear on. Same thing with hip hop. A lot of folks pushing the buttons, making the music, mixing the sound, helping with the lyrics. Like both worlds, you know, there's a headliner, so to speak. But anyone who comes out of hip hop or boxing certainly understands neither is an individual thing. It takes a team of people. And I think that might be one of the takeaways from the book is that none of these fighters or none of these rappers just, you know, were born with a gift that they didn't have to work really hard for. That neither world has someone who just was on day one perfect. You know, Tupac, Tyson, I think they're similar in that kind of way. They were born into really tough circumstances, but they had some really great mentors as well who helped get them to where they needed to be and give them the opportunity to be the legends they become. So yeah, I did try to pull the curtain back and show that for folks who maybe don't understand hip hop so well, or folks who maybe see boxing as an individual sport. Absolutely, both are team sports and they require a good circle of people around you to sustain success. And unfortunately for Tupac and Mike Tyson, I think it's one of the reasons those guys had sort of a tough downtick to the end of their careers. Later in life, they didn't have the best people around. And I think that's the reason both, you know, their careers were sort of cut short because of that.
So much more that we could talk about, and I'll invite people to go. And if you want to hear more, as I certainly do, pick up Beatboxing, go and read it. Todd D Snyder, author of Beatboxing, How Hip Hop Changed the Fight Game. Thanks for changing, once again, how I looked at things. It's not an empty boast or an insult to any of my other guests to say this is the kind of book that I'm scared that I might not have read, because it broadens my horizons. And if you love boxing, you love hip hop, you'll love it in a whole new way, a deeper way, and you'll find new things and things you already love. And if you don't, still, it's a human story. It's an underdog story. It's about how these guys didn't just give up, and we can all use that lesson, get a little inspiration. They were born with a lot against them in most cases, and yet they managed to climb to the very top, or they managed at least to get in the ring and keep hitting. And it's something that I just love. I love this story. Thanks so much for sharing it with me today, Todd. And also, let me tell you, Bundini would be proud of you for putting it together. And everybody go read that book too and listen to that interview. You're a great storyteller. Your students are so lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have you as a guest. So thanks.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you mentioning Bundini, because in some ways, this book is a sequel to that story. Ali and Bundini really are the originators of hip hop and boxing intertwining. I think beatboxing tells everything that came after Ali, where Bundini sheds lights on the formation of those two cultures. So I appreciate you mentioning that, and let's do it again. I appreciate being your guest. Thank you so much.
Sure, you keep writing them, I'll keep reading them and having you on. Have a
great
day.
You too. Thank you.
Again, the book is Beatboxing: How Hip Hop Changed the Fight Game. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at the historyauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Thanks to Todd D Snyder for bringing us into the ring and into the recording studio. And let me tell you, if you do go to that Amazon link and it says customers like you also purchased Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype, do yourself a favor, purchase both books. Amazon, after all, has a very, very generous return policy. And I guarantee you, you won't want to return the books anyway. Once you read them, you're going to want them on your shelves. That's the kind of writer that Todd D Snyder is. I know I wish I had a professor like him when I was in college, or a teacher like him when I was in school. And you'll learn so much in this book, but like all the great teachers, you won't feel like you're learning anything at all. It'll just be fun. Please do check him out at hillbillyspeaks.com or follow him on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you enjoyed watching this conversation, please do subscribe at our YouTube and Rumble channels for future journeys in the Wayback Machine. As for my social media, you can find them all linked at historyauthor.com. Plus, don't forget to check out my Washington Times columns. Again, I'm going to call the shot and say I will be using tapping the brilliance of Todd D Snyder, his insights for a future column very soon, because boxing, rap music, these are things that are part of our culture right now and really reflect the way we live our lives, whoever we are, wherever we come from in history. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you enjoyed this journey into yesterday. Until that next trip into the past together, on behalf of Todd Snyder, thanks so much for going a few rounds with us today, and have a bully week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of